Hey everyone, Ron here from IKN. So in this video here, we wanted to talk through some key concepts when the intention is to promote and encourage rotation via the thoracic spine within the transverse plane, okay? When we're trying to create rotation at the thoracic spine, we need to be considerate of what we're trying to rotate the thoracic spine relative to, okay? And there's three key interactions that we want to appreciate here. Number one is the interaction between the thoracic spine and the pelvis. Okay. Number two is the interaction between the thoracic spine and the scapulae. And number three is the interaction between the thoracic spine and the cervical spine and cranium. Okay. So up first, let's talk about the interaction between the thoracic spine and the pelvis. There are a lot of thoughts out there in the rehab industry about being able to lock the lumbar spine and concentrate that rotation at the thoracic spine. I'm not so sure about that concept, and typically how this is demonstrated is clients are asked to get into a quadruped position, to sit the pelvis back onto the heels, bring the lumbar spine into flexion, and the thought is that because the lumbar spine is in flexion, this reduces the contribution of the lumbar vertebrae to rotate, to assist the thoracic spine moving into rotation, okay? But I think what happens in that situation there is that we tend to lose that thoracic spine rotation on a vertical axis, and we tend to see clients just flexing at the thoracic spine or extending at the thoracic spine or getting a lot of contribution from the scapula, okay? If you were to watch what happens here when I fixate the pelvis and I rotate the thoracic spine and rib cage, which we would view as operating as a single unit within the context of getting thoracic spine rotation. If I was to rotate the thoracic spine to the left, you're going to see the spinous processes move to the right. I'm going to fix the pelvis and watch what happens at the lumbar spine. You're going to see rotation occur at the lumbar spine, okay? This is important to consider because the spinal column is a multi-segmental unit. It's very, very difficult to reduce any kind of segmental contribution from one area, particularly from a neighboring area of the spinal column. So if we're trying to get thoracic spine rotation, we are going to have to get some rotation from the lumbar spine too, okay? So I think what we can consider here is that instead of trying to block the lumbar spine, we want to block or fixate the pelvis instead, okay? Now, if I wanted to get more rotation of the lumbar spine, what I would do in that situation is if I wanted to try and create rotation of the thoracic spine to the left, I would actually promote pelvic rotation to the right, and then that's already going to put me in relative spinal rotation to the left. But if I then continue to rotate that thoracic spine to the left, you're going to see a lot more rotation occur at the lumbar spine vertebrae, okay? So if I was to add some rotation at the pelvis in the opposing direction of where I'm trying to direct that thoracic spine rotation to, then we're going to get a lot more contribution or a lot more rotation through the lumbar spine, okay? And I think a lot of the thought process here, or the thought behind trying to lock the lumbar spine motion, has developed from fear-mongering surrounding the movement of the lumbar spine, where we are taught to try to reduce movement at the lumbar spine, particularly flexion and rotation, okay? But these are movements that we do want to encourage at the lumbar spine to ensure the individual has the ability to access those, okay? So that's the key thing there, is understanding that we want to block the pelvis, not necessarily the lumbar spine, and that will allow for us to get a lot more rotation at the spine, specifically at the thoracic spine. Because what you tend to see, and I'm going to post or put a video of what this looks like on the screen here, and we are going to link a video of an exercise that we utilized on a YouTube channel that you can check out, that we utilized to try and encourage this thoracic spine and pelvic dissociation, where the thoracic spine and the pelvis are moving in opposing directions. But oftentimes what you'll see clinically when you are assessing this, particularly if you have the individual in a seated position where the femurs are flexed or the thighs are flexed and parallel to the ground, if I was to try and rotate this thoracic spine unit to the left, what you're oftentimes going to see is the pelvis rotate in the same direction, okay? And you're oftentimes going to see then the knee move backwards. How would you describe that motion of the femur? I would describe that motion of the femur as a posterior translation of the femur, okay? Now, oftentimes that's driven more so through the pelvis, okay? But what you'll see there oftentimes is the same side knee, the ipsilateral knee, start to retract or translate posteriorly, okay? And just to show you what this looks like from the back, if I was to ask the client to rotate their thoracic spine to the left, you'll oftentimes see the pelvis rotate in the same direction. And you can see that if that pelvis is rotating in the same direction as the thoracic spine, there's no rotation occurring at the spine there at all. So the pelvis, the spinal column, the rib cage, cervical spine, head are all rotating in the same direction. In that situation, if I was in standing, for example, and the femurs were fixed, the only relative motion that would be occurring in that situation is pelvic rotation over top the femur, but we're not getting any rotation at the spine, okay? So that's why I put emphasis clinically on trying to fixate or block the motion of the pelvis, not block the motion of the lumbar spine, to encourage more of a dissociation between the thoracic spine, rib cage, and pelvis, where we want the thoracic spine and rib cage to be able to rotate in one direction, and the pelvis to either be able to remain fixed in place or to rotate in the opposing direction. Okay, so that's the interaction between the thoracic spine and the pelvis. Okay, so the second key interaction to consider is the interaction between the thoracic spine, rib cage, and the scapula. Okay, and we can look at this through a scapular retraction perspective or a scapular protraction perspective. So let's look at this from a scapular protraction or internal rotation perspective. So if we were to create an internal rotation and a protraction of that right scapula, what this is going to look like here is when that scapula abducts away from the spinal column and wraps around the rib cage where the glenoid cavity faces more forward, that would actually be characterized as an internal rotation of the scapula, where the glenoid cavity is facing towards the midline, okay? So in that situation, the right scapula is actually turning to the left. Okay, so the medial border of the scapula is moving further away from the spinous processes, the thoracic spinous processes. Okay, so if I wanted to try to create a dissociation between the scapula and the thoracic spine, I could do so by driving through the scapula, but that would mean that the scapula is the dominant segment that is driving that motion. So what I would want to do in that situation is I can pre-position the scapula in slight protraction, internal rotation, then actually rotate the thoracic spine to the same side or to the right side, okay? Because that would mean that the spinous processes are moving to the left to try and turn to the right. So we're getting that lengthening of the tissues that connect the spine to the medial border of the scapula, okay? But now we're getting those segments to rotate in opposing directions, because we just mentioned that if the scapula is protracting, internally rotating, it's rotating to the left, and if we're turning the sternum to the right, that is rotating to the right. So they're rotating in opposing directions. So it would look something like this, where if you were to imagine reaching your scapula forward, where you're getting a slight protraction, and then you're rotating your thoracic spine to the right, okay? That would be right scapula turning to the left, thoracic spine rotating or turning to the right, okay? And we'll again link that, that thoracic spine rotation movement strategy in the comments below, and we'll show you a kind of a small clip of what that looks like here using the wall, because using the wall allows us to fixate the scapula in place and then drive that rotation at the thoracic spine and rib cage. So it's a great way to, in the video that we're going to link here, it's a great way to not only facilitate a dissociation between the thoracic spine and the pelvis, but also a great way to facilitate a dissociation between the thoracic spine and the scapula. Okay, so moving into the last interaction, the interaction between the thoracic spine and the cervical spine and cranium, okay, or specifically between the thoracic spine and the skull and cranium. So similar to the thoracic spine and pelvis, we do want to create a dissociation between these two segments. What's different here is that we do have a lot more opportunity to drive motion via the head versus how well we can drive motion via the pelvis. It's a lot easier to drive motion via the head in rotation than it is to drive rotation at the pelvis. Okay, we have a lot more range of motion available to us at the cervical spine and at the cranium relative to the cervical vertebrae. Okay, so understanding that, then we can either allow for the head to be the dominant driver of that dissociation between the head and the thoracic spine, where we're trying to keep the thoracic spine fixed in place and rotate the head, because even this requires a dissociation between the cervical spine, the head, and the thoracic spine. Because if I can't dissociate the head cervical spine from the thoracic spine, as I turn my head, everything's going to rotate in the same direction. And you can see that there's no movement that is occurring at the vertebral segments there. So you'll oftentimes see this be displayed in clients where you ask them to rotate their head in one direction and the whole body will turn in that direction because they can't get that dissociation between the thoracic spine, the cervical spine, and the head. Okay. We can also drive that rotation via the thoracic spine as well. So we're keeping the cranium or the skull fixed and then driving that motion through the thoracic spine. We can also drive that through the upper limbs as well. Okay, but the intention would still be to facilitate a dissociation between the thoracic spine and the skull. But what you'll see here is that if I get the skull to rotate to the left, if you watch what happens at the spinous processes here, when the head rotates to the left, that's going to drag the cervical vertebrae along with it. So you're going to see the spinous processes move to the right because they're turning to the left. Okay, so if I wanted to get that dissociation between the head and between the head, the cervical spine, and the thoracic spine, where the head and the cervical spine are really operating not necessarily as a single unit, but as the head rotates to the left, then the cervical spine are eventually going to catch up as they move through a range of motion to allow for further rotation of the head in that direction. But we want to keep the thoracic spine segments a little bit more fixed in place so that we can get that dissociation. Okay, so like we said, what would happen if we don't have that dissociation is that as we rotate, everything will rotate in the same direction. So we can keep the head fixed and we can drive that motion at the thoracic spine. Okay, when the motion is driven at the thoracic spine, let's say we still want to get that dissociation between the thoracic spine where it's rotating to the right towards me, you're going to see the spinous processes move to the left. And if I'm keeping my head fixed in place, we're going to see the upper cervical vertebrae delay their rotation to the left. Okay, there's a little bit more motion available on the skeletal model here, but if I was to block the cervical vertebrae here, as the thoracic spine segments move to the left, but the thoracic spine is driving to the right, we're going to see how we can get that opposing rotation at the cervical vertebrae. Now, what we would naturally do clinically is we may try to create a rotation in opposing directions, where we're not just keeping one segment fixed as the other one rotates, we can rotate them in opposing directions. Okay, so again, the key thing here is not necessarily just looking at what's happening at the cervical spine, but considering how the head is moving in opposition to the thoracic spine. Okay, because we want both of those key segments to have the capacity to rotate in opposing directions, but we also want the individual to demonstrate normal or average range of motion, the objective range of motion values of the cervical spine, the cranium on the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic spine, lumbar rotation, all those normal, average, objective range of motion values. This perspective here just adds another coordinative element where we're trying to promote rotation of those big segments in opposing directions. And this is kind of an easier way to think of it initially because it doesn't really require us to consider exactly what's happening at the vertebral segments, because we're looking at those kind of key segments like the cranium, the rib cage, thoracic spine as a single unit, and the pelvis. So when we rotate the thoracic spine and rib cage in one direction and the opposing, or the pelvis in the opposing direction, then the lumbar spine is going to be brought along for the ride. Same thing when it comes to the head moving in one direction and the thoracic spine rib cage moving in the opposing direction. The cervical spine is typically going to be brought along for the ride. Okay, so that's how we're promoting that relative movement or that dissociation between these key interactions. The thoracic spine is the key thing to consider, but we also want to consider what is it rotating relative to. We've presented 3 key interactions here: thoracic spine relative to the pelvis, thoracic spine relative to the scapula, thoracic spine relative to the cervical spine or cranium. Okay, so like always, hopefully you found that helpful. If you have any questions, please let us know below, but we'll link that thoracic spine rotation strategy into the comments below, and we would have posted it somewhere on the screen here throughout the video.